Hello and welcome to online lecture 8. That's Types of Research Day 2. So last time we spent a lot of time talking about the psychological experiment and experimental types of research. However, there's also non-experimental quantitative research, okay, where there's no manipulation of the independent variable. So in this case, what we're trying to do is provide an accurate description of a situation or phenomenon, or to describe the size and direction of relationships among variables. So we're not trying to say that A causes B, we're just trying to show how A might be associated with B or A might predict B. So in this case, we might have a correlational study, natural manipulation research, or cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. And we'll talk about some of these in turn. First, a correlational study measures the degree of relationship between two variables. Now, just because it's called a correlational study doesn't mean you can only use correlation as a statistical analysis with it. You might very well use regression as well, linear regression, right? Or different kinds of regression. And so a correlational study can also be used for prediction. For example, what if we're interested in understanding recidivism for sexual offenders? What if we're interested in understanding relapse and depression? So how likely is it that people who face one episode of major depression that lasts for this long over this period of time, how likely is it that they relapse? Or maybe we're interested in understanding recovery after mild traumatic brain injury. Okay, so we definitely can look at prediction as well. Or we can just look at something that's more relationship. For example, Conrad and Jones in 1940 was interested in understanding the relationship between IQ scores of parents and IQ scores of their offspring. So they measured each IQ score for each parent and each offspring and then correlated the two, right? So that is an example where we're just looking at an association, or like I said before, we can look at prediction as well. But the primary limitation of a correlational study is the inability to determine causality. We always have that third extraneous variable problem. Let's say we're interested in looking at the relationship between number of fire trucks and amount of damage in a fire. So can we say, based on the number of fire trucks, that number of fire trucks there causes the amount of damage in a fire? Of course not, right? It's really about the size of the fire. That's really what's going on. Okay. So here's a specific example of a kind of correlational study called path analysis. It's a method of testing relationships among variables to see how they fit a theoretical model. And we can talk about direct effects, where a variable directly impacts another, or indirect effects, where the effect occurs through a mediating variable. So let's just take one example here. We have parents' self-efficacy, or their belief in their ability to do something. And that has a direct effect on the parent-child relationship, but an indirect effect on child's mastery, because it goes through parent-child relationship to get to mastery. Okay, so that's just, again, that's just one type of correlational study called a path analysis. And this is something that sometimes people use. I only recommend using it if you know a great deal about your variables and how they're related to each other, okay? Because you are developing a model and then seeing if it fits. Okay. Let's talk about natural manipulation research now. In this case, it's also the case that variables of interest are not directly manipulated. And because variables are not directly manipulated, then because they're not directly controlled, then extraneous variables could be a problem. Okay, so let me give you an example. Let's consider the comparison of psychological functioning of people living near the Twin Towers versus further away. The distance living from the main towers, the Twin Towers, within 2 miles, the near condition, versus more than 100 miles away, the far away condition, is your IV. Okay, so how far or close you live to the Twin Towers is your IV. Okay, your DV is psychological functioning. Now, what's the problem here? Can we manipulate the IV? Can we tell people how far or close they were to live in proximity to the Twin Towers? No, that just happened as it happened. We can only look at their psychological functioning after the event. Okay. Now, this type of research actually has a very, very negligible difference with correlational research. Basically, variables that you're sort of more born with, like, or are, yeah, kind of like that. In other words, like eye color or age or those sort of things are more correlational studies, whereas things like winning a lottery or living far or close to the Twin Towers is more of a natural manipulation. It's a negligible difference, honestly, and I won't ask you to understand or define that difference on a test, okay? So I'm just pointing it out to you, so for interest's sake, but you don't have to worry about it too much, okay? All right. Now I want to get into cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. Okay. So a cross-sectional study is when you assess groups of participants at one point in time, when you compare IQ scores of several different age groups. The potential problem is age cohort effects. Okay. So let's say we're going to compare IQ scores of 7-year-olds, 9-year-olds, and 11-year-olds. Wonderful. But what if it just so happened that there is this age cohort problem, right? What if it so happens that that there's more than IQ that's impacting this difference? Okay. Now, longitudinal studies are a little stronger because they assess the same participants over a period of time. Now we're going to measure changes in IQ for the same participants over several years. Now that's a little stronger study, as you can probably see, right? We're going to measure them at 7, at 9, and at 11. Now, if there is some kind of impact of age and age only, we'll see it. Okay. But what's the disadvantage? Attrition and cost. Attrition and cost. So people are more likely to drop out of longitudinal studies. And to keep people in longitudinal studies, it generally costs some money, right? There's just more cost involved with this kind of study. Now, there's a third kind of study that's actually called a cohort sequential study. Now, this one's really interesting because it's a combination of cross-sectional and longitudinal designs. So different age groups are tested longitudinally. So in a study by Chernard and Roy in 2008, they did this kind of cohort sequential study. They were interested in the changes that occur in students' academic motivation during adolescence. So they recruited a group of 7th graders and a group of 9th graders and followed them until they completed 9th and 11th grade respectively. So basically it was a 2-year study, right? You got your 7th graders, you got your 9th graders, you see how they're doing academically at that time, and then you follow them until they complete 9th grade, 2 years later for the 7th graders, 11th grade, 2 years later for the 9th graders. So you've got both your cohort and your longitudinal, you have both your cross-sectional and your longitudinal components in here, which is really nice. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about, and this will be kind of a brief section, is about quantitative versus qualitative research. Because the truth is, everything I've talked about so far is really a quantitative study. We've really collected some kind of numerical data. But there are qualitative studies where you collect non-numerical data to answer research questions. Okay, that could be anything. It could be an interview, it could be a drawing, it could be any non-numerical data. So qualitative research is more an interpretive research approach that relies on multiple types of subjective data and investigates people in particular situations in their natural environment. It's interpretive. You typically use multiple methods to get at information, and it typically occurs in a natural setting. So let me give you an example of this. Perhaps you're interested in looking at how working impacts academic success. So let's say you want to look at a group of high school students and understand working and academic success and how they feel about that. So you might interview this group of high schoolers in a focus group type setting where you pose some questions, but really you sit back and you allow them to really carry the conversation. And they might talk about how work seems to impact their livelihoods in general, as well as academic success, right? They might talk about their number of hours that they work, or they might just talk about things like stress at work or those sort of issues. So you might record what they were saying, as well as maybe even have them post some kind of drawing or images or slideshow of how they feel about work. Right? So you might collect data using these different multiple methods, but they're all sort of interpretive. Okay. All right. So qualitative research has some strengths. You can describe individuals with a common identity. You can develop theoretical understanding of phenomena. But it can be difficult to generalize findings, right? If you just have this one focus group of 5 15-year-olds, it might be difficult to generalize to a whole bigger group and see if these findings hold. You can also have lack of agreement among researchers. That's actually can be a big problem. What if one person observes a person in the focus group and says, "Oh wow, they're really stressed. You know, I think that this has a really big impact," and the other person says, "No, they seem to be handling it just fine." Okay, and objective hypothesis testing is not used. So at least it's not always used. So you don't necessarily come out saying this hypothesis has been supported or not supported. Okay, so those are some of the strengths and weaknesses of qualitative research. We don't spend, qualitative research is a great area. There is a senior seminar on it, at least historically there has been, and I encourage you to learn more about it if you're interested, but it's not an area we're going to really spend a lot of time on in this class. It's definitely an interesting form of research, but we're going to focus on quantitative research. We are going to focus on both experimental and non-experimental methods, though. Okay. That's all I have for you for this time. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you next time.